Commissioners.
Commissioner Helfrey.
Here.
Commissioner Levitt.
Here.
Commissioner Cohn.
Here.
Commissioner Gargani.
Here.
Commissioner Beatty.
Here.
Commissioner Depler.
Here.
Commissioner Simpson.
Here.
Councilmember Worther.
Present.
Mayor Boland. Acting Chair Lee.
Here. Okay, so second on the list is review of the workshop agenda. I don't have any comments, so you're on your own.
And with your permission, Mr. Chair, I'll give my comments when we get to the main body of the agenda.
Okay,
Thank you.
so public participation.
You crack me up. I do have a question. The goal of the workshop is just to review these documents or to learn about them?
Both. If I do my job well tonight, hopefully you'll all learn something about them and hopefully better understand them.
Okay, it's not to like rewrite them or,
Not at all.
I had a question posed to me about that. And I said, I think they're just reviewing and,
That's it, and
Continuing education, as we call
there you go,
it. Yeah.
class credits.
Yeah. Okay, so Joe, you want to lead us off?
thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Members of the Planning and Zoning Commission, first of all, thanks for coming out tonight. We do appreciate it. It's an opportunity to take a little time and delve a little deeper than we normally get to on certain subjects. And as you know, we've kind of been working through some of the major plan documents we have, and then the land use ordinances that you see on a, let's say, day-to-day basis when you do your job. Tonight, per your all's direction, Mr. Newberry and I have provided you 3 items. Per the chair's request, we have the recent Tree Preservation and Restoration Code that the Planning and Zoning Commission undertook a review of back in 2017, so not very long ago. And that was around summer of 2017, so almost 2 years ago. The next item is our Natural Resource Protection Standards and Procedures. This particular set of regulations has been with the city since February of 1996, and surprisingly has not been changed in that almost 23-year period of time. And I think a key document in all of this, or documents, is the last component. This is something Mr. Newberry suggested. And the first item of that 2-document section, thank you, is Dr. Hammer's original environmental report that he did in September through basically December of 1995. And so this is what the incorporators and then the appointed city council asked as one of the first steps of a new city. Tell us about the environment of Wildwood. Tell us what's the greatest threat to that environment, and then give us some ideas how we might reverse the process we're in, and if we're lucky, heal the scars we've created by past decisions. So that's the first component of the section. And the second, when we did the 2006 master plan update, we asked Dr. Hammer to return and evaluate the success or failure of the regulations and their application by the Department of Planning, and the Planning and Zoning Commission and City Council. So that's the context, our universe of discussion tonight. And I'm taking the liberty to try something different. We can sit here and talk about the 5 variables that form the Natural Resource Protection Standards and Procedures. We can talk about soil slope. We can talk about soil depth, shape, restrictive layers, and soil attributes. We can get very scientific, and probably the best person to be here to do that would be Dr. David Hammer, not me. But we've done this as a staff for you now for 23 years, So we do have a pretty good understanding of the principles, the application. But I thought we might start tonight, and I'll try to do this as quickly as possible, with a presentation that was put together very early on in the city. And it kind of was done to explain the natural resource protection standards and procedures to a wide audience, not just the Planning and Zoning Commission of Wildwood. And it has some interesting pictures, things that a lot of maybe our new arrivals to Wildwood wouldn't recognize. But if you lived in Wildwood prior its incorporation, these would be reminders of why we're here and why that group of incorporators spent the better part of almost 8 years or so trying to get a city in an unincorporated area. So, urban erosion and sediment control, the Wildwood method or madness. So, oftentimes when I used to go out and talk to people, they didn't know much about Wildwood, so I would always start with a picture of what I would consider something that would engage them or make them understand that this isn't like any other community in the metropolitan area. You can go to the east side and there's rural areas there, but they're primarily agricultural. You can go down to Jefferson County, but there is no zoning. There's no control. There's just, in my mind, a bit of chaos that reigns there. And then there's the surrounding counties. I won't speak highly of St. Charles County sometimes because they had the opportunity to see all the mistakes that were made by the city of St. Louis and St. Louis County, and by golly, they seem to have just gone ahead and gotten on that same horse and rode it into the sunset. So I always start with a pretty picture of Wildwood. I also put it in the context of why is Wildwood still pretty? And that's because we were lucky. Geographically, we are the farthest community or the farthest area out from a concentric growth pattern, meaning over time, it just slowly marched from east to west. And it did arrive here. It arrived here in the late 1970s with subdivisions like West Glen Farms, Evergreen, and then thereafter in the 80s and 90s, the floodgates kind of opened. So the next few slides, I talk to people about what is the physical characteristics of Wildwood that make it unique. And first and foremost, I always start with topography. And basically what this says is there's narrow ridge tops, deep and long, steep sloping valley walls, and relief in some instances that's in almost 300 feet. Relief is the difference between the low point and the high point. It's just a simple math equation. And so we all know this. I mean, you can't drive north on Route 109, get down by Radcliffe Place and not look up and just, sometimes you think, this doesn't look like St. Louis County. This is something very, very different. The vegetation that I went into, because it's a key component, it's a mixed deciduous forest. Thursday night, we had a representative from the Missouri Department of Conservation do a presentation to the Historic Preservation Commission, which Ms. Gragnani is the liaison, on the pine plantations in Rockwoods Reservation. And he gave us a lot of great information on the pine plantation, but he also talked about the forest in Wildwood, primarily oak hickory, but there is a transition going on. The maples are starting to slowly but surely integrate themselves into the forest, and they are a succession type of species. And ultimately, there may be more maple than oak hickory. And so it was very interesting. But I think a key point here is what protects the what protects the topography, what protects the soil is our vegetation, and it is primarily a mixed deciduous forest type. So in certain areas of Wildwood, soil is a key component. In floodplain areas and closer to the Merrimack and Missouri rivers, there's a loss that exists. And that's wind-blown silt from the glaciation periods that collects, and it's actually good soil. If you get more down by the Ozark Plateau, you get what most of us have tried to plant trees in, flowers, shrubs, and bushes. A lot of clay, chert, and not much organic matter. And so from that perspective, there is a variety. And depending on where you live in Wildwood, that variety can be pretty productive soil. We've had agricultural practices in Wildwood in years past, or it can just be a struggle. And again, the gentleman from the Department of Conservation identified if you're on a south or southwest facing slope and you're in a hilly terrain, you probably got basically no soil and just bedrock that's exposed at the surface. And you see that a lot in Rockwood's Reservation, Greensfelder County Park, Rockwood's Range, and other locations on private property. So this is more what I think we're all used to seeing, that kind of red, clay, cherry, limestone, shale, and sandstone. So remember, limestone is the predominant rock type in Wildwood. It underlies almost all of Wildwood. It's a friend and a foe. So from the standpoint of friend, it's great because it holds a lot of groundwater. It's the source of your aquifer if you're on a private well. And we have great potable water from the aquifer because limestone filters it, treats it, and for the most part does a wonderful job of providing a resource to our rural residents that's unparalleled in most parts of the state of Missouri. Limestone, on the other hand, is soluble, which means it does get cracks and crevices and all kinds of little holes, caves, and in some instances collapses. And so that's why we have the harbors at Lake Chesterfield and the lake. So friend and foe. Shale and sandstone are interesting. Shale is almost a clay material if you see it in its exposure on a rock cut. It's very fine grained, compact, and very much like a clay. And then sandstone is very porous and doesn't hold together as well as the other two rock types that are identified. So collectively, you have a soluble limestone, shale, and sandstone. So the bedrock is very variable and in many instances unpredictable. So,
Question. Are there any specific spots you can think of where there's a fair amount of sandstone?
Down by Interstate 44 is the area that I've always referenced for people.
River basin.
And some of up river, where the source, so like river system, river corridors. So you might see some down by the Merrimack River and the Missouri River.
Oh, okay.
So I kind of mentioned this when I started off. The action plan that Wildwood started with was to perform an environmental analysis of the community. We've given you both of those. Both of those analyses were completed by Dr. David Hammond. What we asked him to do is define the problem areas, and then we also at that same time inventoried existing infrastructure. And those two may seem kind of not necessarily linked together. And when I get to some of the photographs, you'll see why. But most of our problem areas, as the analyses went forward, were our watersheds, specifically the major creeks that formed a watershed, such as Cox Creek. And what we wanted to do is to define, okay, where in these watersheds where we have public infrastructure primarily, are they at greatest risk? And so it did kind of go hand in hand, so to speak. So create a plan for addressing these areas, modify our land use policies, revise regulations to reflect these policies, and then implement, monitor, and update. So that was the plan we started with. So to kind of give you perspective, again, remember this is early on. So in 1960, this is what Wildwood kind of looked like. So there is no Route 100. There's just Manchester Road. And this is Cox Creek as it winds north toward the Missouri River. And you can kind of see what happened over time as development. Streets look a lot like the creek. And they're awfully close to the creek as well. But as I mentioned, we were fortunate as a community that we were as far west as you could go in St. Louis County. And it took a while to get out here. But when it did get out here, you can see the changes that were occurring. So for some that worked on the incorporation or lived in the community during the incorporation effort, you'll all remember Dartmouth. This was one of the poster boys, girls, for the incorporation. It certainly didn't look like this before development, and as you can see, they did a very effective job of changing and altering the landscape to make it look like anywhere else. Key amongst this picture is poor stormwater management from the standpoint of concentrating flows, and then the red clay soil with the churny rock that's just everywhere you look. Sometimes you wonder how people actually can grow grass on what's left. So here's some other photos. As the environmental analysis went forward and the study of the infrastructure, this was typical in Wildwood for many, many years. Low water bridges, the high intensity, short duration rainfalls, and that's what you would end up with. And so as more development came, it fueled or increased the amount of runoff because there was more impervious surface. And these instances got more serious and more threatening and more problematic. This is the Kerrs Mill Bridge. This came after a storm and it collapsed completely. And Kerrs Mill Road was closed for a number of months. Emergency funding had to be garnered by St. Louis County Council. Emergency process was put in place to let bids. And relatively speaking, they replaced the bridge pretty quickly, but all in all, it's just a great tool or a great lesson that if you don't look upstream, eventually your problems are going to exacerbate downstream. And this is a public infrastructure cost relative to poorly planned development. So maybe $1 million or more. So the taxpayers pay a price, so to speak, for new development. The developers, in some regards, don't pay a comparable price. And I don't say that because you can only do what the law allows, and that says you can only apply your requirements to the property where the development is located. But the taxpayers usually are on the hook for both bad decisions relating to land use. This is another situation. This is in Cox Creek over by Point Clayton subdivision. That's an exposed main line of a sanitary sewer. So at one point, the bank was well over here. The developer and MSD didn't say, put the sewer line and the manhole, so to speak, in the creek. Well, the creek just decided it had enough and it just started migrating, eventually eroded past the concrete structure and undercut the line, and it became exposed. Now, to MSD's credit, once this was identified, they came out and addressed it, but they just buried it in rock to protect it. They really didn't look at the issue that caused it. Here's another instance, again in Cox Creek, where the sewer main was exposed. A major storm came through, a large boulder was pressed against the pipe, cracked it, and raw sewage flowed into the creek. We see in this, the Watershed Erosion Task Force will be looking at a lot of these pictures. This is in Sheba Court, over near the Evergreen subdivision. But as it's been described to me, as more water rushes into the creek during high-intensity short duration storms, eventually it lowers the creek, and as it lowers, it has a tendency to move outward. So the channel becomes larger, but it also goes up into the associated little drainage, ephemeral drainage ways that serve it. It's called headward erosion. And so nothing is protected, so to speak, once the system starts to churn. Here again, Strecker and Church Roads, erosion problem near the street. And as you can see, there's not a lot of room for air in this particular location. This has been corrected. Here's a major endeavor of the city of Wildwood. This is Cox Creek. You can see there is a gentleman holding a rod to kind of give you the perspective of how the height of the creek wall or bank wall there. The yellow arrow at the top of the slide is Strecker Road. So what was going on here is, over time, with each early storm, a little more of the bank would crumble and fall, eventually be washed downstream, and the bank was getting closer and closer to Strecker Road. The city did a $1 million plus repair on that bank there and saved the road. For the most part, it's held up pretty well. So before the bridge on Strecker Road was replaced, near McBride Point Drive and the Point Clayton subdivision, there was a semi-low water bridge. That's what it looked like. It's been gone for a long period of time, but I think the key in this slide is, look what that creek carries in high water events. There's just a whole lot of rock that's coming from somewhere. And that rock changes the character of the stream, and that rock becomes like sandpaper in the stream. And it just wears on the bottom of the creek, the sides of the creek, and any structures located within the creek itself. This was the typical fix. You bring in a dump truck full of riprap, and you dump it on the area of concern, and you'd hope that it stayed in place. Now, there's two things here I would want to mention. First and foremost, there's no gradation of the rock size. It's all big rock, it's heavy rock, but there's nothing that says we're going to put the largest and heaviest rock on the base and tow it in, and we're going to eventually grade that size up as we go from bottom to top. And there's no effort to try to make that wall or that riprap live by planting trees in it so that root system sinks into the bank and helps stabilize it. This was the typical fix. So you can see where some of the rock's coming from that's in the creek. This is one of my favorites. You know, the repairs that had been done are slowly getting undercut. The bridge itself doesn't look too stable. And there you've got a big concrete truck crossing it.
Is that Shepherd, the bridge?
It's at Strecker and Valley,
Oh, and Valley. Oh,
and
okay.
that's been replaced as well. But you can just see, it's not a healthy creek. I mean, if you go into Cox Creek, the main branch, if it's cold out that day, it's colder in the creek. If it's hot out that day, it's hotter in the creek. Because nothing, it's a moonscape almost in many ways. Again, we talked about some of the problems in Cox Creek. Here's an example again, just what happened on a typical basis when there was a major storm. There's a cost to all of this. This has to be cleaned up, so the taxpayers have to spend money to address it. And again, as time went on, these incidents became more regular. They weren't occasional or infrequent. And so from that perspective, it was a cost that needed to be addressed. This is Strecker and Orville, and this bridge has been replaced as well. So, as time went on, as you can see, the hard fixes, just pouring a concrete slurry onto the bank to stabilize it, while always undercut. And once it's undercut, it slowly but surely breaks off here, 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 and just works its way up. It has nothing to underpin it, to stabilize it. And as you can see over time, it slowly but surely disappears. Sorry about the slide. A little dark on that one side. So, while we're here tonight, so we had all this great information. We had all these photographs that just kind of depicted all the problems with urban stormwater runoff when the land use densities, the stormwater regulations, and the land use codes were attuned. And so we gave the charge to Dr. Hammer, again, to analyze it, identify the problem, stormwater runoff, and how might we address it. And one of the steps was the Natural Resource Protection Standards and Procedures, the matrix. And so the intent was to minimize stormwater runoff, restrict construction to the most stable landforms, and those 5 variables I mentioned tell us where those stable landforms are. To recognize the variable source areas and keep them functioning, that means those things that transport water in the appropriate way. Don't mess with them. So if it's an ephemeral drainage way, it's working well, don't put a pipe in it, don't cover it over, don't disturb it, protect it. And then recognize and avoid other environmentally sensitive areas. So in the matrix, there are a number of areas, this is on page 45 at the bottom, that basically say these are 100% protected. Don't even think about using them for any development purpose. Rivers, streams, intermittent streams, floodplain, wetlands, fens, glades, ephemeral drainage ways, sinkholes, springs, areas of previous mass movement, and then finally, any land that has slopes of greater than 30%, roughly about 3 to 1. So those are the 4 main charges. So, what was the criteria of the matrix? Well, first and foremost, it was meant to be site-specific. So when a development proposal was submitted on the parcel of ground, the matrix was there for purpose of identifying that parcel of ground, to look at that and that alone and how best to use it. Use the local soil and landform attributes, best available information, have it be logical, based on science, not just on I don't like development. I don't want development in my backyard. Be logical. And then finally, back then, and it seems kind of silly now, I guess, to a lot of people, but it had to be defensible in court. And again, just kind of giving you back a little picture of history. The Home Builders Association of Greater Missouri, many of the large builders, and to a certain degree, St. Louis County, spent a great deal of money, time, and resources basically trying to stop Wildwood in the circuit court system, the Missouri Court of Appeals, and the Missouri State Supreme Court. It was not an easy process. No one backed away and said, we're going to let the residents make a determination regarding their destiny. No, they fought it. They fought it hard, they fought it long, and in almost every level, the city of Wildwood or the incorporators won. And so, given that legacy, our charge when the city was formed is to do things that were logical, defensible, and basically understood the information we had and to make it site-specific. The data sources we used in almost all instances was St. Louis County Soil Survey. Remember, the matrix is premised on soil, primarily soil and its characteristics. Topographic maps, geological surveys, long-term hydraulic soils, soil interpretation data. We know what the soils are, but there is accompanying data that basically tells us a whole lot about it. Sand, silt, or clay, depths of the changes in the profile, where bedrock or rock is exposed, restrictive layers, attributes. There's a Wishmeyer-Schmidt rainfall erosion model. And this is one that's pretty interesting, the last one, long-term weather data. And that was, I think, 1999, one of the National Association of Soil Scientists held their national conference here in St. Louis. And we brought a lot of them out here. And it was interesting to hear them talk, but most of them felt that one of the major expectations of climate change would be that weather would change. And that here in the Midwest, we'd probably see more rain, and those rain events would be more intense. And in certain instances, instead of a short duration, a long duration. And a couple storms we've had at the start of each of this week and last week kind of indicate that may not have been too far off in their prediction.
2 record floods on the Merrimack in 18 months.
Yeah. Yes, ma'am.
I've been in my house 4 years now when it flooded. Our barn has flooded 5 times. And all the years,
Prior to
but
that?
you know where my house is.
Yep, I
I
sure
mean, we
do.
had 2 feet of water in the barn on Monday morning.
My gosh.
And we were stunned. It's like, what do we do? So now it's like, what do we do?
What
Do
do
we
you
build a
do?
berm? Do we move this? I mean,
Praise the Lord.
I've lived there since 1971. We've never seen anything like it. It's just,
And
it's crazy.
like last week when we had that terrible storm and, we had Wild Horse Creek Road flooded, there were water rescues there, we had Centaur Road flooded, we had portions down by State Route 109 and Woods Road flooded. In your instance, obviously the area behind Cox Creek. And so people were calling and it's like, we're getting all this water, what are you doing? You've got to stop development. And I guess what I would say is we don't have that much development to stop.
It's not development, it's not causing it in my subdivision. It's the
And
weather.
It's the weather. And it's hard to explain to people that there's something going on, at least if it's a cycle and it's going to change. Maybe it's not long-term climate change, but we're in some kind of sequence right now where what we're seeing is very, very unusual. And standards we have from the Metropolitan St. Louis Sewer District for stormwater can't address 5-inch rain over a 5-hour period.
Yeah.
There's nothing that we can do.
No.
And so that's the hard part to tell people. And you know, the first thought I have is all this stuff we did not working? I mean, I think I should mention, one of the first things the city council, the appointed city council did, and then the first elected council, is they basically said, stop. We're not going to have, other than town center, densities that work in Florissant, because there's the big Florissant Basin, which is a lake that filled in from glaciation times. And it's flat, it's great soil, and you can build anything there. You don't have to worry about it, let's say. It doesn't work out here. So I trust, I'm defending the commission, I'm defending city councils and defending staff. It's like, I think our stuff works. It's just there's a variable in there that we can't control right now, and that's the weather. And it shows, you know, it rains now like it's mad. You know, it's like, it's not a,
It's, a lot of your photos are from '93, and we had a microclimate condition here after the flood with all the snow. We have the same thing going on this year. We are an island. If you fly into St. Louis, we're surrounded by water.
Yeah.
And these storms are popping up on top of us. They're not developing in Texas and working their way here. So it's a problem that's caused locally from the sheer amount of river water we have. In Missouri, have you seen the Missouri River?
It's huge.
It's like 4 miles wide. in some places. So that's what's causing this. It's not, and we're just in one of those summers where we've got this microclimate.
Yeah, my company's had more emergency flights of the rivers and stuff around here this year than I think we've had in the previous 19 years I've worked there. I mean, we've flown the Mississippi from, I don't know if we've gone all the way up to Iowa or not, but St. Louis down to Cairo. We've flown some stuff in Mississippi, like way back in January, February. Arkansas River even. I had no idea they were even flooding because of all the news about the rivers up here. Flown the Missouri up to South Dakota pretty much. Yeah, it's crazy. A couple tornado responses.
Yes, sir, Mr. Gregani.
First of all, I can tell you that Mr. Vunich did a great job of summarizing this for you. I was there when a lot of this took place during the incarceration. In fact, one of the tasks that I was assigned was to look at the soil situation and the types of soil that were here in the Wildwood area. So I had a chance to study some of those maps up close and personal. The dividing line, interestingly, is Highway 100, so to speak, more or less. If you go north of Highway 100, you get into what's left of some alluvial plain, which was partially covered by ice. And so there are some flat areas, and there's a lot of soil types there that are loamy. As you move south of Highway 100, you get into Ozark Islands, at the beginning of the Ozark Islands, and a lot of limestone, gravelly, sandy soils, more hilly terrain, a very typical division, and it's based on the natural occurrences that occurred long before any of us were here. Stormwater runoff and situations with stormwater control were a big issue at the time of the incarceration. It had to be addressed by the incarcerators, and we tried to do the best we could. One of the examples of how it got screwed up before we got in charge came up at the city council meeting about a week ago when they were talking about Lake Chesterfield. Lake Chesterfield is not a lake. Let me repeat that. It's not a lake. It's a wet area, a drainage. It's a drainage basin is what it is. It was put together by the people who built the subdivision, and they didn't do a very good job of it because there were several things that were a problem. Number one is they didn't study well enough to understand it. They didn't care that there was limestone holes underneath that basin that drained the water out, which is one of the reasons why that area doesn't hold any water. The other thing was they had to put a sort of quasi dam at the far end, because if you're going to have a catch basin, you got to have four sides. You can't have one side open. So they put what is basically a dam at the far end, or it's on the north side, and we put a road over the top of it, and they put a road over the top of it for the subdivision. Now the city has a problem because the so-called dam is being eroded away, and it's taking our road with it, And we have to fix that because it's our responsibility. People want us to fix the lake. There ain't no lake, and we can't fix it, it doesn't belong to us. And I don't know if there's any way to really fix that. One of my suggestions was you fill it in with some loamy soils, shallow it up, and you turn it into a marsh. I don't know if anybody's gonna go for that or not, but that's one of my suggestions. You make it as natural as you can. Try to restore it to some natural status if at all possible. And just as an aside, I was a month ago in the great state of Alaska, one of my favorite places to visit. There are no more tidewater glaciers. They've all melted away. I was shocked. 12 years ago was the last time I was there. I've been there several times to Alaska. I got the pleasure of seeing the glaciers up close and personal. There ain't no glaciers up close and personal to see anymore. The climate is changing. I don't know if it's global warming. I don't know what it is, but the climate on this planet has changed in over billions of years. It's changing again. We may be, in fact, at the end of an ice age. Whether another ice age will come later, this I can't tell you, but I do know that it is changing. And so the things that we're seeing here are not our imagination, they're real, and they're gonna get worse before they get much better. And good job, Joe.
For what it's worth, last time I drove over the dam, I thought given what could have been there, I thought the remnants of the lake looked pretty nice, just being all grassy.
Should blow it up, make a bridge.
So after the matrix was developed, we had to sell it then to a lot of different constituencies. And so I talk about those: the development community, design professionals, residents, property owners, city staff, attorneys, other communities. Obviously, all of these constituencies needed to understand why we were doing it, the benefits from it, and how it actually could help them in the long run. So the next few slides, I call them rules to grow by, and there is some truth to it. Remember, the incorporators and then thereafter, we've always said that we weren't opposed to development. What we wanted was well thought, well managed development, meaning that you had to look at the property, you had to look at the infrastructure, you had to look at the utilities, you had to look at the neighborhoods, you had to look just beyond what was shown to you by a development entity on a plan. So the first of those is, again, the matrix looks at percentages. If something is a water feature, it's 100% protected. But we also go 90% protected, 80% protected, based upon the combination of the 5 variables. So if you have shallow soils, let's say a depth of less than 6 feet, they're concave, and they have a restrictive layer, like a perched water table. That's in the end, you're not going to be able to use it. We collectively combine those variables and the percentages to create the total. And in some instances, it's 100%, even though it's not necessarily a water feature. The next one, if it's concave in shape, avoid it. What that means is it's accepting flow of runoff like this, and you should leave it alone. And you shouldn't develop in concave areas because it concentrates flow. We want convex, a dome, because it spreads the flow. It improves the flow. Ridge lines, that's where development belongs. Valley walls and the valley itself, the concave portions, no, it doesn't belong there. Ridge lines are the principal areas where development should occur. We also, as part of the matrix, you can't build too close to things. So we've created buffers, 25 feet, 50 feet for certain features to protect the feature and to protect the property owner from an inevitable conclusion, which oftentimes happens. Things move one way, the immovable objects doesn't, and eventually the two meet. This should look familiar to Ms. Helfrich. This is one of the first major developments that we did in Wildwood with the resource protection standards and matrix. And this basically just says, the greater the contiguous area of non-disturbed land, the better. That's the whole crux in one sentence of the resource protection and standards. Get as much of the protected area as contiguous as possible and then build around it. And for the most part, Windcrest, I think, is a very good example of a successful application. Let's make this work at water lie. So we prefer retention over detention. That's the way the resource protection standards and procedures. If you can retain it on site and not send it downstream, great. If you can retain it in a basin and not like detention, it's preferred. So the matrix kind of talks about that. So here's an example of that. This is what the natural system looked like back in March of 1993. As development was proceeding forward in January 1997, and when it was all said and done. So those were MSD standards. They've changed dramatically. They're radically different now. But
Is that my backyard?
They got,
That's not my backyard, is it?
No.
Oh, okay.
MSD's basically adopted our plan
For the most
for
part.
the most part, so.
But under the resource protection, this area would have never been disturbed. There would have had to been some stormwater management. I don't know exactly how. But this and this, just not good.
Yeah, that looks like the detention basin behind my house.
I think this is actually one of the smaller ones up in Dartmouth.
Oh, okay.
So, in the end, what we're trying to do is, through the resource protection, save some of the natural character. So you've got new development, but some of these trees, you can tell, they weren't planted as part of new development. They were protected, and they preserved the character, and that's what the matrix wants. So we also did a lot of other things besides the matrix, and I'll talk about those. We talk about site distance, grades, maintenance, things along those lines. We accept greater grades for streets. St. Louis counties was 8%. We'll accept grades on certain streets up to 12 to 15%. What that means is they're a little more rankus. It can be a tough street to drive on in certain conditions, but it also means we eliminated a lot of the grading to bring it down to 8%. We did the same with site distances. So we tried to balance public safety and environmental quality. We have the lighting code, as you know. We worked very hard on that to preserve the night sky, to eliminate nuisance glare, and to avoid light trespass. So, and there's a lot of people out there that were competing against us not to have this all happen. And they started with the state of Missouri, St. Louis County, MSD, MDNR, EPA, Corps of Engineers, fire districts, and other municipalities. And so at one point, it would have been easier just to eliminate them all than try to work with them, but in the end, that wasn't an opportunity we had. But that was a hard lesson we learned early on. Despite all the science, all the evidence, a lot of the state and federal jurisdictions just didn't seem to understand what we were trying to achieve. So we had got the grading, the subdivision, the tree, which we provided to you tonight. Looking back after 5 years, that's when we did this. We kind of went back and went through the action plan. And we all wish we had more brains, right? And the answers to all your questions. Thank you. So that's what we talked about a long time ago. And as I said, the resource protection standards and procedures hasn't changed. And so I'm glad to talk about it if you have some questions.
A comment, you didn't say it, but it's in there. The PRD, which you've heard so much controversy about lately, that's one of the reasons why the PRD exists, is to be able to protect those areas and still be able to meet the 3-acre minimum requirements. So when people tell you the PRD is no good, it doesn't work, it's designed to destroy the 3-acre minimum, it's none of that. It is designed primarily for that reason alone. Am I right?
Yes, we hired an attorney in Connecticut. He was recommended by Jonathan Barnett, our master planner. His name was Brian Glazer. He had argued 2 land use cases before the United States Supreme Court. And his advice to us was, if you're going to basically change your land use profile, meaning the densities of residential development across the board, and you're going to make the non-urban resident district the cornerstone to your land use policy. And then add the natural resource protection standards, the grading code, the tree preservation code, and other land use regulations via the zoning ordinance. We need something to offer property owners, to offer the development community that says we can put all those together, and the PRD will allow us to look at each site individually, and if there is something that's too onerous, have something there, a relief valve. So as you can develop at the appropriate density, meet almost all of the requirements, but have a development that actually can move forward and come to fruition. So the PRD, at its inception, at least in Wildwood, was a recognition that if we applied everything that we had thought of, it might be just darn hard for anybody to have a project move forward.
And your land property values go to 0.
Yep. And then you've really got some angry people because they've invested, whether it's a 3rd generation that's owned the property that their grandfather or great-grandfather settled, or if it's someone new. In the end, the responsibility of the city, in my opinion, is to provide public safety and to preserve property values. And if we can't do that, we need to basically get out of the business of government.
I just want to thank you for sharing your knowledge and certainly your passion. I think this would be an excellent presentation for council as well.
Well,
They have to listen.
What?
I'm sure they would, but thank you, Mr. Levitt, I do appreciate that. But when I was going through it earlier today, this afternoon, it was like, I can't tell you how just radically different this was. And I went around to I was invited to Kansas City on multiple occasions to talk about what we were doing. People were really interested. And they just would shake their head and they're like, "You're really doing this?" And it's like, yes, we're trying. And it's like they would just wish us well and say, "I just don't see how it's going to work. There's too many negative forces out there trying to stop you." And it's like,
Still are.
You have one more component of our soils that we need to think about, and you have a meeting tomorrow night, but that's the deer.
The what?
The deer. The deer have destroyed our forest undergrowth. There's nothing alive except for old growth
And honeysuckle.
woods and honeysuckle. And as that continues to happen, those soils or topsoils are going to just go right into the creek because the deer are going to destroy Wildwood.
Ghana.
Hasn't happened yet, but it's going to, unless they get chronic wasting disease and then they're all dead.
Right.
Mr. Lee does identify a real problem. The understory, the forest floor, it's becoming a monoculture instead of a diverse culture of different plants, fauna, flora, etc. It's a serious problem.
So you were successful in creating your wildlife connectivity?
And they're flourishing.
Yeah, they are.
But
We need a couple mountain lions.
Yeah, we do.
We've got some. Yeah.
there are some out
And
here.
blackberry too.
Yes, ma'am.
So I was wondering if anybody has commented on this or noticed it, but I use the Al Foster trails and all that network over there frequently. And the number of trees that have fallen is just mind-boggling. I mean, big trees, and then I drove through Rockwood Reservation a week or so ago, and the trees that have fallen in there, I'm amazed at the number of trees. You know, you always see a tree here or there, but there are so many.
Yeah, there were 2 giant ones off the paved Rock Hollow that went down earlier this summer, and just the hole that opened up where they were, it's like,
And some of them
Man.
have other trees, but even on those, you know, the single track trails up further in the woods, I'm just amazed. And Bluffview has changed. That trail is so different.
Probably a result of the high winds and all of the wet soils that we've
Right.
had.
Yes.
Oh, they're just popped out of the ground.
Yeah.
But it just, you know, through all the years, I've just never seen so many.
you know, we go out there to trim them with Gork sometimes, and it's like, with all these trees that have fallen, how are there still any up here?
It's bad. It's really bad.
Well, each Monday afternoon, our superintendent of Parks and Recreation, Gary Cruz, gives me an assessment of what happened in the past week, what needs to be fixed in the parks, what is happening, so to speak, et cetera. And he tells me, it's like, I guess that storm last week, the beginning of last week, devastated a lot of the large growth, old growth trees down in Rock Hollow. And it's just like, him and I asked the same question. It's like, what's going on? And is there gonna be any trees left after a while? Because they just go down so regularly now.
You know, the deer eat the undergrowth, so the root systems are all gone, and the trees, it's easy, soil's easily eroded, and as a result, so, yeah.
The deer,
It's all the deer's
serious
fault.
problem. It's the deer's fault.
It's all the deer's fault.
Well, you know, the first thing we always do is we start backtracking up.
Right.
So what's going on up on the ridge lines, and not just that first set, but second set, et cetera, down in the Rock Hollow area, other than Breetown Woods, there's really not been a new development down there of any significance since the city incorporated. So it's not new development.
No, it's not. But what we do have, though, are the people that have moved into the area. Many people don't necessarily like living in the woods, even though they're saying they like living in the woods. They like to have a nice clear area for a yard, courts, whatever the case may be, you know, or just so they can have a view. You know, you think about it in that area, especially off of Ridge, so many people will cut down the trees to think they can get a view down to the Merrimack Valley. And so that's, you know, that certainly has to contribute to it to a large degree.
Like I say, I mean, Ms. Simpson, you're absolutely correct. I sometimes wonder what do you do? Hopefully the Watershed Erosion Task Force will have an answer.
And then just a question about it. What do they do then with all that? Are they just gonna cut like where the trails are, or will they clean up that? Or, I mean, it looks, I mean, I know trees fall and then they decay, but are they just gonna leave a lot of that?
Some of the larger, or the largest of the large, it's just impractical for us to get the right vehicle down there to address it. The smaller ones, we'll cut those up and haul them out and try to keep the corridor, the immediate corridor, at least at Rock Hollow, as presentable as possible. But some of them are so large, we just don't have a vehicle that can get down there across the bridges, then load up and then get back out.
It's a lot like Babbler, if you ever hike the trails in
Yeah,
Babbler.
we have
Same
talked about
thing.
Babbler. It's been closed for weeks this spring because of trees being felled.
Yeah. And they just cut the 5 foot out of the tree and your trail just goes through it
Yeah.
and just let it sit there, so. Castlewood's got the same thing.
Mr. Chair, Ms. Bedwick had a comment.
Yes, Jean?
Go ahead, no, go ahead.
Oh, well, I just wanted to say that I was on one of the first planning commissions, and Joe, you know, educated us at that time on the environmental report. Well, I was involved in the incorporation too, but, and then and I'm proud to say I was on planning commission when your subdivision was built, the Windcrest, and also, you know, involved in the lighting ordinance that we adopted, which protects the sky. And I'm thinking these are all really valuable tools for the planning commission to continue to use these to reinforce how the city of Wildwood will look in the future. Because you can see what happened as the county, since I live in Winding Trails, and we're downstream of Dartmouth and the high school, and at that time, MSD had very poor regulations on stormwater management, and as depicted by the pictures that Joe showed of Cox Creek, I can also show you neighborhood creeks that have tripled in size just in the last couple of years, and we have in our subdivision we have flying mains, sanitary mains they're not in the earth anymore, and so that's a result of poor management prior to Wildwood. And so what I wanted to ask Joe is to give, you know, you said that our intent was to try and heal some of the scars, and encapsulate that and tell us, how do you think we've done as far as trying to heal those scars, and have we made a difference? I mean, I already know my answer, but I'd really like the professional answer.
Well, it's a good question. Just to let you know, like, one of the pictures I started with was the Dartmouth subdivision, which is at Clayton Road and Route 109, and extends east on Clayton Road to Winding Trails. One of the things we tried in there is we actually retrofitted their largest detention basin. Knowing that MSD standards when Dartmouth was approved and constructed were not the best, the largest basin had an outfall structure, and its throat was gigantic, the slit where the water travels through. So we actually got permission from the homeowners association and MSD to basically retrofit the throat to hold more water for a longer period of time. We've done that there, and that is the single instance where we've been successful in trying to work with existing stormwater features. So to answer Ms. Vedvig's question, I would probably say, I would give us a C+ in terms of healing the scars.
Just given my history here, I would say we've slowed it. It's still marching, but we've slowed that march to a large degree.
That's why it's a C+.
Yeah, yeah.
Because we're still, as you can see from the formation of the Watershed Erosion Task Force, there's still problems out there popping up.
Well, I think the two, and forgive me for jumping in, I think part of it is the reality is that we have so much development that was already here in place that we just have to continue to work with, retrofit if possible, but it continues to contribute to the problems in the main areas.
So, you know, it's like, now I'll shut up for a second. So imagine the appointed city council's about ready to sit out on September 1st, 1995, and St. Louis County's dealing them a hand of cards, and they pick up that hand of cards, and one of the cards says, we've approved 1,800 lots, many of which have yet to start. Good luck with them. And that's part of what I think Mr. Werther's describing. Even though we incorporated, there were 1,800 lots in principally the Cox Creek watershed that had been approved and had vested right. And so we had little choice in terms of how we managed those. Yes, ma'am.
So my first thing I want to do is make a comment, and that is that this is by far my favorite meeting that I've ever been to ever with you. And it's because I feel like this was just cut for me. So for all of you that don't know, when Rich and I moved back from Dallas, we needed to have a home right away, and we moved into Dartmouth. And we were not an original homeowner. We bought someone's home, who never moved into it. And so in answer to your question about how you grow grass, you buy several truckloads of dirt, and you have your grandfathers come and help you spread them, and then you lay sod. That's how you grow grass there. And we did have problems there, and the storm detention place that you spoke of was at the end of our street, and Remax had a balloon land there. So I mean, I was there, and then when we were ready to move, I said, I wish they would build a house that I liked between here and Dearborg's, and then Windcrest opened up, and it was the same builder that I had been looking at. So we're there, and we have 3 lakes that sometimes hold water and sometimes don't, although they're doing much better now. I have a backyard that when we bought the lot, we thought it was this huge, massive lot, and we did not know anything about natural resource protection. And so I think, you know, people that come out to Wildwood or people that know me or know that we live in Wildwood think that Wildwood is beautiful, and I'm so very proud of living here. The one thing I would say is that the presentation that you did, I found very, very enlightening. I loved the pictures, to see the changes, to see why we did what we did. And I think if there was a way that we could educate the people in Wildwood, and I don't mean like sit down and have this presentation, but so many people don't know about the natural resource protection. Don't know what it is, don't know why we have it. And when you're buying a home, that's not something that you know to look for. I lived in Wildwood, moved into Wildwood, and didn't know about it, right? And as you know, in our neighborhood right now, we have people that battle us routinely over this natural resource protection line. So I thank you for showing this and for educating me just a little bit more. And then my thought would be to somehow figure out a way to get some of this information somehow to the masses.
Can we put it on the website?
You know, I mean, really. So that's it. We have a natural resource protection letter from the city on our website that says when people can look and see what you can and can't do beyond that, but that's a little too late sometimes.
So I'm not picking on you, Ms. Helfrey,
Yeah.
so read in between the lines she's spoken. She moved to Windcrest. Her lot is substantial in size and very
Yeah.
deep. The usable area on the lot, though, is not quite as much as one might expect, and that's the case in Windcrest. It also, again, is one of our best applications, I think, because we were able not only to preserve a lot of the sensitive portions of that property, but we also got MSD to work with us, and we retrofitted the original design of all of the detention basins in the original Windcrest. And they work great. They work great. And it's just a success story.
My backyard is unique because it kind of, I guess, tells how stupid we were. We did not know that there was this massive kind of, for lack of a better term, creek bed in our backyard because all the weeds were high. And so how we found out was after we built our house and went back there to start, you know, knocking down weeds and almost fell down this cliff. And so the water runs off. But I will tell you that we had a problem at first when Levinson was still building the top of the street because they changed the lay of the land. They promised people things that I don't know that the city knew about it, we didn't know about it. They literally drowned 3 trees in our yard by changing the flow of the water. And so in all the wonderful things that we've done, we still have problems. I have 2 of my neighbors up at the top of the street. I went up there and, you know, banged on their door and said, you know, here's some black tube. Put your drain downspouts into it because you're washing away my yard. You know, and so if you look out, you see these going, just, it is what it is, but.
Really, you could sue them. You have rights.
Well, you know, I just assumed it works, right? It works and I'm fine with that. But I'm just saying.
Cheaper to buy the black tube.
Yeah, there's two things that.
But my point
Yeah.
though is that I think that people don't know. You know, like I said, I lived in Dartmouth in Wildwood and I didn't know. So if we could just figure out a way to let people know more, that's all. I just find this all fascinating. I'm so grateful for it.
Cindy, go ahead.
So I also want to thank you for your presentation. It has been really helpful. I guess also maybe potentially on a negative note, it's like, I was just kind of wondering how villages at Brightleaf got away with, you know, no detention ponds, and they're using detention ponds, and, you know, there's hardly any preserved green space unless it's in between, you know, kind of towards the new park that's going in. I mean, was there a PRD or something that they utilized to do that?
Well, it goes much more to the basic level of the land use decision-making process in Wildwood. So I kind of alluded to in one of the slides that whatever we did, we always looked over our shoulder and made sure it was defensible in a court of law. And our master planner, Jonathan Barnett, was very clear when he said, you're going to have a difficult time preserving the non-urban resident district areas if you don't have a location in Wildwood that accommodates higher density residential, multiple family, and to a certain degree the services some of your residents want, commercial, let's say. So he brought with him Andres Dewani and New Urbanism. And so Town Center became the one location in Wildwood, the 800 acres of the 68 square miles, where we kind of apply the environmental regulations a little differently. It's just a basic decision made many, many years ago. And the reason being is, with New Urbanism, your intent is to have higher densities. Your intent is to have more streets, sidewalks, alleys. You have a greater need for the full utility network. We want public space. And for the most part, we have to manage stormwater per MSD. So when you put those 5 things together, crowning one of those 5 being the higher density, we just don't apply our environmental regulations the same way in Town Center. It's not a consolation to you all that live on the perimeter or the boundary.
So I mean, is there an anticipation that maybe that might not happen in the same way going forward, even in the Town Center area?
Yes, ma'am.
To defend us, though, when we were looking at the plan, we developed on the ridges, we left the headwaters of the creek alone. So there isn't a lot of stormwater detention required because the valleys are still intact and the filtration process is still intact.
My neighbor across the street would probably disagree with that because the back of his house, he's seen way more issues than he had before. And the detention pond has turned into, you know, it might become a marsh or something because it's always holding water and it's,
Well, that's what we want,
mosquitoes.
right? We want.
I mean, it's a mosquito heaven. And,
Yeah, that's
you know,
there's, what I was gonna say earlier, there's 2 things that we should be concerned about when we look at plans that Joe presents to us. Grading, you cannot move water off of a property and put it onto another property where it isn't already flowing. That's a rule. And so if we can control that in the grading analysis, that's what we should be doing. In other words, if water's flowing across your property, you cannot move it someplace else, all right? The second thing that we should look at, and the developers would not like this, but wherever we have a pond, like what you're talking about, you have to drain that down to the lowest point of the stream, whatever it is, the valley. And then you have to run it out on a horizontal to slow the velocity of the water, because velocity of water is what causes erosion. Riprap is probably the worst thing you can do because the velocity's there and you just put all these heavy ball bearings there that are just going to eat away at the ground. So it's going to erode twice as fast with riprap. So that pipe distance, and it could be off-site, which we don't have control over if it's all we're looking at is the on-site. So when that velocity is discharged, that's where most of these problems are going to come from.
Right. I mean, I think There was an existing pond on that property, and, they pretty much filled that in and moved this detention pond probably a good 50 yards one direction. I'm sure that's the underlying cause for some of this erosion issue. But, I appreciate I understand the town center philosophy, and, I agree it's a good idea. It's just, hard to see neighbors having their issues.
It's a good idea in principle and application. If you live near a town center boundary,
Yeah.
it can be a little bit discouraging. I understand that.
Commissioner Helfrey.
I have a question with what you were just talking about water movement and velocity and all of that. If we look at, for the sake of this, that Payne Family Homes development that's been under consideration, and they were talking about building this massive retaining wall along the backside of that property. Well, doesn't that kind of play into this? Am I misreading that? Because now you're talking about water that's up here, and now it's going to go, and it's going to just jump off of the wall and drop, and there's that creek head there. How does all of that affect that? And how does this come into play there?
The reserve has a stormwater management plan that complies with MSD's minimum regulations. Saying that, there's some practical or functional issues that the department has grave concerns about relative to the stormwater plan, and it has even, in some instances, greater aesthetic concerns. And one of those functional issues is how they treat that transition, that boundary area you just described.
They're collecting it all on the top and then sending it downstream as opposed to on site, right?
Which again is one of the basic principles of the resource protection. Every time you basically collect water and put it into less and less area, you're concentrating flow,
Right.
which leads to greater velocities and creates problems. So in principle, you really just want to spread it out as much as you
Right.
can.
But this water comes crashing over this wall, and then it ends up down here, and it starts eroding and washing away.
And you have an issue of, just like that's been identified in the manners at the Meadows of Cherry Hills. And we've asked McBride and Son Homes to address it. They have yet to do it, but the person at the end of the line is slowly but surely seeing his yard eroded, and the water's getting closer and closer to his patio door. So your concern is well-founded.
Okay, thank you.
It's something we need to look at very closely when we're looking at sites.
I'd always heard about how much that drops off on the west side of 109 right there. It wasn't until they paved that extra line and started cutting away the brush that I saw just how much that is with doing the construction.
It's deep.
Yeah.
I am curious how that section of the roundabout's gonna look on that side.
They're gonna have to be buttressing that quite a bit with something.
When you're looking at the tops of the trees as you come across the highway and look at the plan, they're gonna fill that whole thing.
That's it.
Right, and I was thinking of the same thing as I've been driving by, like,
Well, we have this commercial aspect in the criteria,
right,
and
exactly. And
if
that's
we
a
could
big-
get rid of
that's
that,
a
we could
big
save
issue.
the trees and save the valley.
Like on one hand, being that Pond Elementary is right across the street from this subdivision, it's like, I want to see dense development there so kids can have an easy path to school and be able to walk to school and stuff. But then at the same time, it's like, I guess we couldn't take that out of town center without opening ourselves up to a giant lawsuit.
Well, we have a committee, the Town Center Update Team, that can do exactly that.
I don't think that'll happen.
No. View the 50-acre site that forms the reserve, maybe in this fashion. From Manchester Road on its southern frontage, that is the most favorable terrain. A resource protection analysis will indicate that. As you go north and you go to the east, it gets worse. And so when the department reviewed the plan, I like what's happening on the south end because it works. I don't like what's happening on the north and east ends because I don't think it works. And that's why the department's recommended denial. There's a good plan in there somewhere. We just haven't seen it yet.
Then again, I'm going to poo-poo on developers and development at this point, simply because it's a matter of getting the organizations, the businesses that know how to deal with it and work with it. It's an unfortunate thing that all too often developers end up getting either a contract on a piece of property, they buy a piece of property, and then they're like, you know what, this is what we did, and we're going to go ahead and make it fit here.
You're trying to put a round peg in a square hole.
Lack of a better term, man.
Well, I will tell you that I just happen to think where I live is pretty cool. But when Levinson went belly up, the city came in and helped us. And I have to say that the guy who ran our HOA at the time, Larry Walker, I learned a lot from him, and he was very smart. And at the time, Jones Company, right? Pulte Homes came in and they bought the remaining lots, and they were going to come in, and he said, this isn't business as usual. You're not going to come in and put in you have to match us. We were here first, and he fought tooth and nail, and God love him, he did a great job at making them fit us. And I guess that's what we're charged with a little bit. I do want to go back one thing to the porous rock that you were talking about. And so, like at my house, when my neighbors put in a pool, a natural spring came out of the ground, and it moves. Yes, it's fun. And there's one that's come out at my mailbox, and water just comes out all year long, except for about 2 months a year. There's not anything you can do about that. It's all over out here, right?
Yes.
I mean, that's pretty much it.
Was it uphill to you?
Well, the one is uphill for me. The one with my mailbox has been like that for years. It just,
Could just be a
starts
porous
raining.
water too.
Yeah. I know that one of the houses on the other side was built on a cave. They had to backfill that cave, it was like 30 feet.
And that's limestone.
Mhm.
It's very soluble, and water affects it. There's losing streams because, you have a surface stream. It'll hit a weakness in the limestone and you'll lose it, and it'll reappear somewhere else downstream. It's just, you have to be very, very cautious, and that's why, as commission members, you require, every time you make a recommendation, that we get a geotechnical report on the site. So a geotechnical engineer goes out there and they do test pits, have an understanding of not only the soil structure, but the bedrock. And our Department of Public Works reviews it, either approves it or not. And that's a lot of what goes into the process as well. So you require that on every project.
What's going on Etherton right there as you drop into the valley? There's been that giant puddle there ever since the first 4 inches of
Darn
rain.
good question. I think there's a spring that's appeared up top based upon the amount of flow or amount of rain we've had.
Because there's always been runoff there, but then all of a sudden,
It's just,
yeah,
it's there all the time now.
yeah.
Yeah.
So you do understand, of course, that Missouri is cave country. In fact, my house is built on top of a 30-foot thick dome that covers an ice age cave. We know it's there. We've run into it a couple of times on projects that we did when they dug our water well. They lost a bit in one of the side channels. And when we put in a geothermal system in our house, they had to move back towards the back part of the lot in order to miss the cave because they can't put the wells for the geothermal in the void. So we know it's there. And I'd like to open it up and turn it into a underground armory.
Or the Agadaga Gragnani
The
Cave.
Great Mountain
Yeah.
Cave. Come see the Great Mountain
Might
Cave.
be gold in that there cave.
One of the commitments we made to all of you is we would stick to a hard and fast hour and a half. We're getting close. And I have one last thing to say, and it's a positive. So My wife, who doesn't know much about land use other than what I share with her, used to come out to Wildwood before there was a Wildwood every spring to go to Gilberg's Perennial Farm. Gilberg's Perennial Farm was the originators of a lot of the perennials you now see in Home Depot, Lowe's, etc. They would do a spring catalog. A lot of gardeners would wait for that spring catalog and make their western or eastern or whatever direction trek out there. So before Cindy Gilbert got out of the business and Doug as well, and then Cindy passed, I asked my wife Diane one day, how's it look out there? And she told me, and she gave me the best compliment I've gotten probably in a long time. She said, looks the same as it always had. And I took that as success. We had saved the non-urban area. So it works.
Yeah.
You guys do a great job. So we appreciate it, Mr. Newberry and I.
Not without your help.
Absolutely. Everybody can be replaced, but you all can.
Joe, great idea.
That
Great
writing.
presentation to council. It might make sense, quite frankly, just to update it too, you know, and then provide that presentation. And back to all of us, because I think we'd all be surprised, shocked by some of the photos, some of the befores, afters, how things are working today, what's not working today, and have an understanding of it.
That's a great idea. The befores, I have the befores. I'd like to show you some of the afters.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That'd be the way, that would be the one good thing I think it'd work.
Yeah, I was gonna request that you share this presentation, but yeah, updated would even be more helpful.
See what I can do.
Yeah.
Thank you, sir.
Nice suggestion.
One other thing, just to let everybody know, MSD has, I think, figured out what they're doing now. There's been a couple of lawsuits, a couple of consent decrees, and their whole stormwater way of doing things is not anything like what it used to be. It's more in line with what we're doing with bioswales and retention and foliage and things like that. So what that will cause, though, are more wet ponds with more mosquitoes. So we're going to have to be cognizant of that, because you want to create environment for clean water, but then you also create what you don't want. So there's a balance.
Always trade-offs.
There's a balance. So.
Hey, I watched the show
Well,
last
I'm
night
seeing
and
a
there
ton
was
of
duality.
frogs around my place with Main Street Crossing going in.
The good with the bad.
There's one about this big that's been living in my window well to the basement.
What is it?
I've had a frog about
Oh,
this big.
yeah. Hey, that means you have a healthy
Sure.
environment.
I know.
And then we'll wrap
I'm not
it. Go ahead.
complaining.
I thought you were gonna say snake.
I've got a patch of grass that's
So we're-
unmowed because I was trying to save one. They kept trying to hop across where I was mowing a couple days ago.
So I want to thank the Planning Commission and of course Joe and Travis for doing this tonight. And I just wanted to ask you, and you don't have to answer, but will this information help you with future decisions before they come before the Planning Commission? Not just on the land use, but on the lighting ordinance too. We have such good things. And you know, sometimes people continue to focus on the negative. I'm not talking about anyone here. But if we would just take an inventory of all of our successes, you know, like Joe was saying earlier, everyone said, this will never succeed. And so we have shown them that it will succeed. And it's going to be sustainable just because of commissions like yourself. And I think it's a great idea that you bring that suggestion to go to the council too. So thank you. Thank you for letting me ask a question.
Okay, I think we can wrap this up since we're right at 8:30.
So again, for
Thank you
Mr.
for this.
Newberry
Thank you very
and
much.
I, we appreciate you coming tonight and being patient during a rather long presentation. And thank you for your questions and comments. Those help us a lot too as we move forward. So thank you all.
Thank you.
And this is a very unusual week. I'll make note of it before we turn the live stream off. Other than the deer subcommittee of the Board of Public Safety, there are no other meetings this week at City Hall.
Oh.
This we have a break.
The deer
It is.
subcommittee, I'd like to be on that.
Oh, so it's kind of a funny week. It's that fifth Monday.
That's right.
So thank you all.
All right, Travis, hit the switch, turn it off.
I'd like to see that.